back to the Contemporary Arts Museum because that's where the action was in the late 40s and early 50s, before the Museum of Fine Arts built its Mies van der Rohe wing. This delightful painting by Frank Fried, Frank and his wife Eleanor from, I believe Frank was from Houston. I don't recall exactly. I believe he was from Houston. Eleanor was from Memphis. Well educated and well traveled, both of them. Frank, extraordinarily talented amateur and interested in, both of them very interested in art, traveled in the art circles in Europe regularly. Frank did these quasi-naive paintings of various things, always interesting social comment. This, an opening night at the Contemporary Arts Museum, Frank Fried was showing first in the Houston Artist Gallery, Polly Marister's gallery on Main Street. There's a wonderful monograph by William Camfield called More Than a Constructive Hobby. And his wife, Frank's wife, Eleanor Kemper Fried, was the critic for the Houston Post. This painting is from 1955. And it would show the Contemporary Arts Museum in its original location downtown, with the kind of paintings that, and this would be before Germaine McKechnie had been hired as director, with the kinds of paintings and sculptures that people in town would be likely to own, that they would then bring in for exhibitions. It would seem to be, there might be Adolf Gottlieb here, an Archil Gorky there, Baziotes here, Fritz Glarner there. It may be a Jackson Pollock there. My guess is a Lee Gatch here and an Alexander Calder up there. You can actually look, people who know Houston, and this has been documented in the Frank Fried book, look and discover people that you know in the picture. Gertrude Barnstone and her husband Howard here, and right in the middle, this gentleman here with a dark suit is Alvin Romansky, who was noted for always having dandruff, and so Frank Fried put the dandruff on his black suit, which is, everyone found it terribly amusing. I think even Alvin thought it was amusing. The other mainstay at this time, together with Robert Prusser at the Contemporary Arts Museum, was Frank Dolejeska, a very different sort of person than Robert Prusser. Close friends. Frank Dolejeska became the custodian of the Contemporary Arts Museum when it opened, installed shows, took care of things, swept up and so on, and painted quite well in I would possibly say a cubist, almost surrealist quality to the paintings that still exist. When Frank's youngest son Tim died of meningitis, he destroyed most of his flat work, and also had quite a struggle with his faith and essentially had given up on painting and decided that he would just make decorative items. Towards the end of his life, he did begin to draw again from nature. My family and I were blessed by being close friends with Frank in his last 20 years of his life, and he was also a person much beloved, and was one of the original members of the group called Handmakers, a group of craftsmen that put together by Preston Fraser. And there should be a monograph written on Preston Fraser, also one of the founders of the Contemporary Arts Museum. In the small space next to the Houston Artist Gallery was Handmakers. Among the people who worked in Handmakers with Martha Roach, Frank Dolejeska, Ruth Laird, Stella Sullivan, and Freud, which was Preston Fraser's handmade candle company. Handmakers moved to a space in the Galleria in the mid-60s, late 60s, and then closed. Frank Dolejeska was a student of McNeill Davidson, and then let's move to one of the most curious people on the scene here. Never, I don't think, ever actually lived in Houston, but showed in Houston consistently at the New Arts Gallery, and even had in many exhibitions at the Museum of Fine Arts in early years. There are early examples of his work at the Museum of Fine Arts. This is the work of Forrest Bess. Forrest Bess lived across the Intercoastal Canal from the village of Chinkapin, Texas, south of Bay City. Forrest Bess, when he was in the Navy, started a long correspondence with the psychoanalyst Carl Jung. It was a correspondence that existed for decades. Forrest Bess had an exhibitions with the Betty Parsons Gallery in New York in 1948 and later, and had his painting shown at the New Arts Gallery in 1956, 58, and 1960. And more recently, a major show of his work at the Hiram Butler Gallery in 1984. The Houston artist Terrell James did a great deal of research on the work of Forrest Bess. Forrest Bess is an artist that deserves a major monograph. The Museum of Fine Arts, director of the Museum of Fine Arts School, was once they was a firm director, actually appointed not just Ruth Euler and James Chilman running the show, but hiring a man to do it, was Lowell Collins. This painting's, Lowell was born in 1923. This painting, my guess, is from, I would say 1960. It's in caustic, which is a wax medium. Lowell Collins had gone to the museum school. He had worked with James Chilman and Ruth Euler. He went to the University of Houston. He studied with Richard Lilliot and James Chilman both at the University of Houston. And at Rice, he went to the Art Students League in New York. He rooms with another Houston painter, the portraiteurist Edsel Kramer, at that time. He also studied with Thomas Hart Benton and Otis Dozier. Benton, the most significant of the Midwestern regionalist artists, and also had been a teacher of Jackson Pollock, and Otis Dozier being one of the senior members of the I guess it would be the Dallas group, is where Otis Dozier is most associated until he went to teach at the University of Texas in Austin. He was the first director of the museum school in the late 1950s until the early 1960s, when he retired from the museum school because of a personal disagreement he had with the director over the treatment of the school by the building manager, Mr. Tom Deere, that Mr. Sweeney actually really needed to have the good side of, because he needed to install exhibitions, but Mr. Deere had a running battle with the school, and I think Lowell had enough, so decided he would open his own school. Lowell was a gentleman, talented, and put together an extraordinarily talented group of people to teach at the museum school in those years. He hired me to teach at the museum school in the summer of 1958, having arrived in Houston just 4 or 5 months before. His son, Michael Don Collins, is a painter who lives in Houston today. In this period, we're at the very end of the 1950s, beginning of the 1960s, a lot of very interesting things are beginning to happen as the Houston artists look more broadly into what's happening in other parts of the United States and the world. Lila McConnell also went to Rice University. This happens time and time again. She showed with Polly Marster's Houston Artists Gallery, and then later with Ben Dubose Gallery, and studied with Mark Rothko, and studied Mark Rothko, and studied in San Francisco with Clifford Still at the San Francisco Art Institute. This work from 1961 is very similar to a piece that Germaine McCagey, then the director of the Contemporary Arts Museum, included in an exhibition on Texas Painting and Art in America, published in 1961. I think probably one of the first times that modern art in Texas was published in a national magazine as an essay about what was happening, and this was about Houston in 1961 in Art in America. A close friend of Lila's, also Rice Institute, also a teacher of, a student of McNeil Davidson, also someone who, as you will see, a lot of people go to Cranbrook for their masters. Stella Sullivan went to Cranbrook Academy and outside of Detroit for her master's. Cranbrook was an important school where she got her master's, her MFA. She was a member of the that made handmakers and the Houston. She showed next door also in the Houston Artists Gallery, Polly Marster's gallery. A good friend of hers was together a student of McNeil Davidson, an artist that doesn't surface here, Jean Charlton. Not much seems to be surfacing in collections that I know of Jean's work. I think I have a small sculpture because that Lowell gave me that he said to me that it was Jean's, but I'm not entirely sure. I have it packed away. It's a little plaster piece about so high, and it doesn't have a signature on it. Once again in the early 1950s, Paul Maxwell comes to the University of Houston. He went to Principal College in St. Louis, got his BFA in 1950, went to Claremont College in LA. He started teaching at the University of Houston in the early 50s. What was particularly interesting about Paul, who left Houston, I think, in 1959, Jack Boynton and I and Paul had studios in one strip of Waugh Drive, just north of Welsh Street. Paul had for the first public television station in the United States at the University of Houston an art program where he interviewed artists for an art program. Of course, there's none of this left. None of it was taped. But that Paul Maxwell was the person that did this. I believe Paul might still be living, and so I think that it would be worthwhile for someone to look into what his recollections of that time are, since there's nothing else available on that. Also, University of Houston student in 1953, graduate, Henri Gadbois, who was born in 1930. Was awarded a D.D. Feldman, was collected for the D.D. Feldman exhibition in 1955. They published a nice catalog. Henri was taught by both Prusser and Lowell Collins at the Museum School. He was in the Army in the mid-50s. He came back to Texas, to Houston in the probably 56 or 57. Married Lila shortly after that, Lila McConnell shortly after that, And they both went to Europe in 1960, and this painting, which is called, one of his Tuscan field paintings, is from that period, in 1960. It's hard to completely understand the importance of architecture in the city, and the fact that there were a number of talented architects who worked as painters as well and had reputations. One of these was Bill Condon, once again, Rice University graduate, showed with the Houston Artist Gallery, was an architect with the Travis Brashear firm. He showed with the Houston Artist Gallery as well as did Bose Gallery later on. And he developed a paper lithograph process where you would use sensitized paper and you would ink them up and print the prints on an etching press on damp paper, and you could only get like 6 pulls before the process started to go sour. And in the years 1956 to 1958, at the Museum of Fine Arts School, he, together with a large number of people, produced interesting prints. I was on the tail end of that. I did do a few prints, but was so busy doing other things I didn't complete the prints or finish them up, but I knew the process, and I knew a lot of the people that were working there at that time. Doing prints. It was a very ad hoc kind of situation. But one of the most interesting things that does come out of this, I should say a little bit more about Bill. Bill was an architect, as I mentioned before. He had a long life. He was very much part of the community with Jolly, and was a very talented artist, very good using collage together with drawing. I recall his large Christmas cards, which were done on tissue paper, collage, silk screen, a little bit of gold, a little bit, very jolly, very good, very interesting. The printmaker that's most interesting, this next man, is Paul Spragga, whose son Eric is a friend of ours and shows with Bill Reeves Gallery. Paul Spragga was born in 1901 in Riga, Latvia. He studied architecture at the Riga and Karlsruhe in Germany and Berlin, where he received a doctorate in 1935. Always an artist at heart, he did beautiful pencil sketches of landscapes. I'm quoting from his son's remarks. Of landscapes in forest in his youth. Dr. Sprohge immigrated to the United States in 1937 to Houston, Texas, and worked in architecture until his retirement, and the whole time made drawings, paintings, and watercolors. In 1956, he started making paper lithographs at the Houston Museum of Fine Arts with his friend Bill Condon. And still with tremendous work, energy, and enthusiasm, he created an amazing number of these paper lithograph images, some harking back to his European background, others inspired by his new surroundings, travel, and boundless imagination. In 1980, Paul Sprohge stopped making paper lithographs and created a series of marker drawings. There are hundreds of these images, hundreds of these, apparently, of these paper lithographs that Paul Sprohge made in this time in Houston. And since we have Paul, we're going to go to his son, Eric Sprohge. And once again, I'm going to read directly from Eric's notes. Moved to Houston with his father in 1937. He was born just 5 years before in Riga, Latvia. I think this is the way, from what Eric says, this is how they got out of Germany. It was through Paul Sprogge's, I think, grandmother was Jewish, so they were in danger of being rounded up by the Nazis, so they went to Riga and immigrated directly from Riga to Houston because there were family friends, I believe, in Houston, some connections. As you all know, it was difficult to immigrate into the States at this time for various reasons. You had to really kind of have a sponsor, so I think they had a sponsor. Well, Eric was born in Riga, Latvia in 1932, lived in Latvia in Germany, came to the USA in 1938, lived primarily in Houston since, went to public school starting early on in Houston Museum classes. 1948, received a scholarship at the Museum School of Art under Lowell Collins from Robert Prusser in the era of Ruth Pershing-Euler and James Chilman. He designed and built dioramas and displays for the Houston Museum of Natural Science under Robert Vines, another important name. From 1947 to 1949, attended Rice University from 1949 to 1954, received Bachelor of Science in Architecture and was awarded the William Ward Watkin Traveling Fellowship. Remember, William Ward Watkin was the architect in residence at Rice University and one of the first great architects to reside in Houston, which enabled him to travel and sketch in Europe. After a stint in the Army, he worked in the architectural field, spent years doing architectural illustrations, which, with his other background, explains his fascination for the three-dimensional early trips to Mexico. And in 1961, living in San Miguel Allende, painting in the Instituto Allende, counts for his intrigue with the surreal of a spirit so behind the call reality, which still lurks in his current works. This piece, early piece, this is from 1961, of this figure holding this bull with this rather surrealist, almost Yves Tanguy kind of surrealist landscape behind. Of course, we all knew who all of these people were.